Welcome, everyone, this is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Surprised Nedzu as UA's top exam scorer. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. The moment Izuku woke up, he knew that this was not his bed. The blankets wrapped around him were too thin and the chill in the air seeped into his body. His arm, in its cast, gave him no pain, and his neck didn't give him nearly as much trouble as it had when he woke up strapped to that chair. Still, his body ached. The deep-seated soreness was oddly reminiscent of how his quirk pains felt, but they were not the same. Not at all. This feeling filled him, clouded his brain and clogged his lungs. It made him lethargic where the pain of choking his own quirk would give him a needle-like throbbing. He was coherent, but barely. Izuku tried to remember what happened before he passed out. His thoughts were slow, muddled by whatever kept him in this state. He remembered the training camp, being kidnapped, the doctor. All for one. Izuku? He stilled at the sound of Tamura's voice so close to him. I know you're awake. Stubbornly, Izuku didn't move to turn over and face him. Clinging to his clarity, Izuku did not give in to the mushy bits of his brain telling him yay. Reiki's here, because he knew it was really, oh no, Tamura kidnapped me here. Izuku, please, Tamura said. Sensei said he gave you a quirk, so I need to make sure you are okay. It was his worry that finally pushed Izuku to turn over to face him. Feels weird, Izuku said lowly, not meeting Tamura's searching gaze, instead focusing on the artist's gloves he wore, too full. Tamura knelt beside him, concern etched into every twitch and furtive glance. I wanted to talk to you, he whispered. Izuku chuffed half-heartedly with a grim sense of humor. He finally met Tamura's eyes, hoping to convey what his mouth was too cotton-filled to say. You did all this to talk with me? He leaned back a little, pink rising high on his cheeks, so Izuku thought it was safe to say he understood. No, he said petulantly. People need to see that the League is still a force to be reckoned with. You were just loot from our raid. I thought I was player 2, Izuku said teasingly, stumbling over the words with slow enunciations. He dazedly pushed himself upright, darkness blacking out his vision before eventually receding. Izuku blinked, feeling like time slowed with each second that passed. Tamura was sitting beside him now. When did he get there? Izuku. He made a noise in response, wondering why Tamura was saying his name. I was just asking if you wanted to rest some more? Oh, Izuku thought. That sounds nice. Izuku's head drooped slowly in what was meant to be a nod, but by the time he blinked again, Izuku was nestled back under the covers. With his face pressed back into the pillow, it was ridiculously easy to drift back into his slumber. Tamura watched Izuku fall asleep with a frown on his face. Sure, he had known that having another quirk assimilating into his body would take a toll, but it shook him to see Izuku act so out of it. This was his friend, his best friend, and he didn't even know how to help him. When Sensei talked to him after Kurogiri dropped Izuku off in his room, he said that it would take time for Izuku to adjust to a new quirk. Tamura hadn't even been told that Izuku would be receiving a quirk. No one told him until Kurogiri was quietly explaining that the doctor was done with him, when Tamura hadn't even known that he was doing something other than tending to his injuries. But he should have guessed. He should have thought more about why he wasn't allowed to see Izuku, why it was taking so long for the doctor to give him some bandages. He hadn't, though. Instead, he entertained his new party members, trying to keep his mind off of Izuku like Sensei suggested. Izuku's neck was bruised. Days old and fading, the skin still had the impression of a hand pressed into him. Tamura's knuckles turned white as his fingers curled into the edge of the bed. Unharmed. That's what his orders were. Unharmed. According to the others, no one had seen him until Toga and Mr. Compress ran into their group. By then, they said he already sustained his injuries. Mustard didn't have a proclivity for close combat, nor the hands that would match the large bruises yellowing Izuku's neck. Moonfish would have left him in pieces or in his stomach. That meant Muscular went after Izuku. He was the one who hurt Izuku. Tamura thought it was lucky that the heroes had arrested him. Things would have gotten bloody if he returned. Tamura, Kurogiri called through his door. May I come in? If he said no, Kurogiri would leave. It was one of the things he thanked him for through the years, giving him privacy where sensei would never. The TV in his room sat in waiting, a reminder that sensei was always there, but Kurogiri always asked to come in, always respected his autonomy. Yes, he responded. Kurogiri stepped inside using the door. How is he? A pause. How are you? Did you know? He said instead of answering. He knew he didn't have to explain what he meant. Partly, he said, one hand still on the knob of the door. But I am not well informed, Tamura. Merely a mode of transport. I knew where I needed to take him, but that is all. You're not, Tamura muttered, snorting. Mode of transport, please, he practically raised him. But, you were thinking about it, weren't you? He asked. Kurogiri never liked to talk about the Nomus. He didn't like to talk about the doctor in general, and Tamura didn't push him. Sensei said not to worry you, Kurogiri said, turning away from the TV. Tamura's blood boiled. He was angry, but not at Kurogiri. Once again, Sensei was the person his ire was aimed at. Once again, Sensei was treating him like he didn't matter. Would you like some fresh air? His head snapped up. Kurogiri's yellow eyes met his, then glanced at the TV. Yes. Izuku blinked and, this time, the world sped up. A vestige of someone stood in front of him, all wispy and ghost-like. She glowed a deep green, her image distorting and reforming too quickly for him to properly see her. Darkness shrouded the area around them, unwilling to give him any ideas as to where he might be. Izuku? He flinched, eyes darting back to the person in front of him. She stepped forward and he stepped back. She stopped, the hand she had raised to reach out to him stilling. Izuku? She murmured again, his name filling the void around them. Where am I? He asked, trying to think of where he could possibly be. It was familiar, but being here put him on edge. He didn't want to be here, being here meant. Oh. Izuku glanced around again and thought it was a decent guess to say that he was in his mindscape thingy. He put his gaze back to the woman, wondering why she was in here with him. Who are you? Her distortion stopped, her wisps sinking into a solid form, and for a moment, he saw her. Inko. His voice trembled but she nodded all the same, her joy visible for a few seconds before she began to unsettle again. He rushed forward, desperate to help and to find out what was happening. I don't understand, how are you here? I'm sorry, she said without answering. Once again, her hand reached out, and this time, Izuku didn't step away. I'm sorry, Izuku. Anger swelled at her apologies as he thought of the nights before she disappeared, of the words she last said to him. Izuku turned his face away from her touch and she stepped away. He said he killed you. She nodded. He said that you wanted to come back. He gulped, trying to swallow his emotions as she nodded frantically, her voice coming out in sharp whispers and echoes as she tried to reassure him. I think I have your quirk now, Izuku said quietly. She dipped her head again in agreement. I don't really want it. But you can use it, she suggested, a certain grimness in her voice. I can help you, make sure you aren't over, Izuku asked, almost shouting. How? Last I checked, you couldn't lift more than a 10-pound weight with your quirk. The smile she gave him was full of teeth and befitting of a beast. Organs don't weigh that much, she said, her expression softening as realization dawned on him. A lot of things don't weigh that much. I don't want to kill anyone, Izuku said firmly, not really my style, you know? The area around her eyes stilled long enough for him to see the look she gave him. That's all right, she told him, I'm glad it isn't. But she had made him aware of the option, should he need to make use of her power. He was sure All for One didn't count on him thinking of using her quirk to rid someone of their internal organs. Otherwise, he had been crazy to give him Inko's quirk. We are almost out of time, she warned. Will I see you again? Izuku asked, torn between his hope and pain. She offered him a small smile. I love you. The world around him snapped into focus, jolting him awake, and Izuku realized he was alone in the room. Unbound and fully functioning, Izuku stepped towards the door. Kurogiri had never tried to explain the Nomu projects to Tamura. He himself didn't have nearly the amount of knowledge to properly inform him of what the doctor's purpose was. But he did know some things. He knew of the husks that he ferried. He knew of the Nomus sitting in waiting. He knew of the countless people that were killed to obtain such creatures. But apathy overrode anything that could turn him away from his work. He was there to serve his master and this was how he could do it. Collared and tailored, He would obey every word, every command. Then, Izuku. It wasn't that Tamura didn't bring out something in him, but Izuku would have been like him. He practically would be if the new quirk settled in right instead of overtaking him. A new feeling, or perhaps an old one, made him shirk his desire to follow all for one no matter what. Izuku had been a child when the doctor began to test on him. Kurogiri had a body, beneath the collar, the suit, the mist. And in the moments when he isn't a taxi or a caretaker or a servant, sometimes he wonders if he was somebody. He wondered if Izuku might ever think the same thing. That thought chilled him to his core, everything inside of him deeply and wholly against such a thing ever happening. So, he told Tamura about the Nomu projects. On the other side of the city, sitting in a park, Kurogiri told Tamura what he knew. There was more, he knew. There would always be more than what he could tell him. But with the way he clenched his fists, the way his face twisted, Kurogiri knew that he couldn't let whatever happened to him happen to Izuku. What do we do? Tamura asked. It won't ever be safe for him if he is with us, he admitted. Not with the doctor and sensei. Then let's get rid of them, Tamura proposed. I'm tired of sensei treating me like a pawn, and if he tries to hurt Izuku, I'll just have to hurt sensei first. It won't be that simple, he reminded him. He and the doctor are not just people we can wipe out. Sensei, maybe, Tamura admitted. But the doctor? He would be an easy PK. This is not something we can just rush into, Tamura. It's not something we wait on, either. What if, he trailed off, then steeled himself. What if we had the heroes take him back? Immediately, Tamura was against the idea. What? He hissed. We just got him. And we will have him for as long as you would like, but where would be safest? With us, or with the heroes? He started to say something but cut himself off, realizing the same thing he had. If they wanted to effectively destroy Sensei, the doctor, and the Nomus, Izuku had to be taken away from the equation before he could be used against them. If he stayed with them, there was too great a chance that he could be held hostage or turned into another Nomu. We just got him, Tamura said quietly. I know, Kurogiri agreed. Izuku was not as fully functional as he first thought. The doorknob to Tamura's room was clenched in his fist, a ready weapon. Also, an accidental weapon. Inko's power hummed under the skin of his palms and he shushed it, spitefully thinking of how the doorknob shot into his hand and nearly made him give away the fact that he was awake. Izuku, whirling around. Izuku almost threw the doorknob in frustration as Tamura and Kurogiri appeared. Couldn't they see that he was trying to escape? We have a plan. Izuku knew that their plan had a few holes. Okay, a lot of holes. Some things were hinging on pure luck, which none of them seemed to have in excess. They needed to get rid of All for One and the doctor, neither of which would be easily done away with. They needed to get the heroes to both the hideout and the Nomu factory. Giving the heroes a tip would be easy enough with Kurogiri. Tamura could kill the doctor while the heroes attack and, if they were just lucky enough, All Might could take All for One down for them. After that, Izuku would safely be in the heroes' custody and Kurogiri could take himself and Tamura away. Izuku didn't like that he was so ready to let Tamura kill the doctor, but a small, bitter voice in his head said that he was only getting what he deserved. Who knows how many people he killed to further the Nomu projects, or how many more people he might kill. The reasoning didn't quell the uneasiness in his stomach. He was supposed to be a hero. He was going to be a hero. So he was going to let Tamura kill someone for him? He didn't even argue. Izuku just stood there, listening to them say they were going to kill someone. The worst of it was that Izuku didn't feel guilty about it. He knew someone was going to die and he was okay with it. Relief was one of the first things that he felt when he heard them say they would kill the doctor. Relief. What kind of person feels relieved when planning a murder? Izuku, are you still with us? Kurogiri's voice snapped him out of his reverie, reminding him that he was supposed to be listening to them flatten out a few details. Yeah, just say it again. Tamura gave him a skeptical look, stopping Kurogiri from talking. No, something's bothering you. He narrowed his eyes as Izuku tried not to squirm. Tell us. It's fine, Izuku insisted. Really, if this is about Ragdoll, I assure you, she will be included in the rescue, Kurogiri offered gently. Izuku's thoughts were abruptly dragged away from the doctor. Ragdoll? Why she's here? He said hysterically. Don't change the subject, Tamura scolded. waving off Izuku's sputtering that Kurogiri changed the subject. And why was Ragdoll here? You're worried about something, tell us. A minute passed of him and Kurogiri staring Izuku down before he caved. Is it wrong that when you said you would kill the doctor, I felt relieved? Izuku asked hesitantly, nerves quieting his voice. I'm supposed to be training to be a hero, but I'm somehow okay with you killing someone. I know that he's done a lot of bad things. To me. To countless other people. But is it okay for me to use that to justify? The doctor has hurt many people, Izuku, Kurogiri stated calmly, laying his hand on Izuku's shoulder. He hurt you years ago, and he has hurt you again. The relief you may feel is not a sign of your morals crumbling but a reaction based on his actions towards you. Kurogiri's hand tightened. You are right when you say he has committed horrible acts, some of which you were the victim of. Do not think any less of yourself. A man will die, yes, but he is one that took lives without a second thought. If it makes you feel any better, I'm the one that's gonna kill him, not you. Tamura chimed in. And I think we're all going to be relieved when that Bastari nodded. No more deaths by his hands. No more Nomus, Izuku agreed. Tamura introduced him to his new friends. They did not get off to a good start. Surge, Toga squealed, lunging for him. The knife she threw at him disappeared through a portal, but Izuku still reacted, backpedaling into Tamura, who practically snarled at her. What did I say? He growled, glowering at her with a protective arm around Izuku's shoulders. If any of you hurt him, you're dust. Dabi gave Izuku an appraising once over. So, it's true then? You're working with the League? Izuku straightened, jostling his broken arm. What did you just say? It's true. What the hell did that mean? Why would I be working with the League? Decidedly confused, the members of the League looked to Tamura for an answer. He's really not, Tamura said, the words almost regretful. Why do you think I had you guys kidnap him? He wouldn't have come here on his own. What a surprise, the media is spouting lies and crackpot theories to the general populace, Mr. Compress drawled. At the expense of such a promising young hero, too. Izuku shuffled closer to Tamura, beyond confused. I don't understand. What's the media saying about me? They're calling you a traitor, Spinner said. They are saying that you have been conspiring with us to take down Hero Society. They also spilled information about your past, Magna said resentfully. Someone leaked your case file, kid. After a minute of thinking, Izuku just sighed. He should have expected it, honestly. The kid with a weird quirk, questionable history, and ideals. Who wouldn't target him? This is why I wanted to stay out of the spotlight, he muttered. But no, I had to meet a serial killer. Spinner trailed off, glancing to where Toga was giggling. Are you talking about Stain? No, I'm talking about the other serial killer I know, Izuku muttered, then bit the inside of his cheek. Izuku thought about it and realized he actually knew a troubling amount of serial killers. Since meeting all of them just now, the number of murderers he knew just increased, too. His gut churned at the realization, but he shoved down his feelings and let out a small sigh. Yes, he said, disdain clear in his voice, I'm talking about Stain. Their reactions varied from amused to confused to irritated, but Izuku really did not care at this point. Stain was trash, through and through. Whether or not Tamura's new gaggle killers agreed was not important. Look, I get that you support him or whatever, but I do not particularly value a serial killer's opinion on me. You are quite the interesting figure, Surge. Mr. Compress said. No wonder Stain spoke so highly of you. Izuku gave him a flat look. What did I just say? Kurogiri, the TV crackled, putting Izuku's mind into danger mode. Bring me Tamura and his friend. Any sense of calm was squeezed from his lungs, All for One's voice sending reminders of the pain he experienced when he forced Inko's quirk into Izuku. Tamura's arm tightened around Izuku protectively before he stepped away and nodded at Kurogiri. In a flurry of darkness and mist, Izuku found himself regaining his balance in a familiar room. All for One was in the same chair as before, facing where Izuku stood alone. Tamura and Kurogiri stood on All for One's side. You withstood an additional quirk much better than predicted, All for One mused. Even without eyes to gaze upon him with, Izuku felt himself being observed by the villain. I would like to credit the doctor's remodeling, but you present so many variables. Your quirk is shriveled, crowded into a cage it has only just begun to creep out of. Is that why you recovered so quickly? Because there was room that there should not be? He doesn't know, Izuku realized. He doesn't know about quirks retaining a piece of their user. It made sense, now that Izuku thought about it. Izuku's quirk made a space inside his head that shouldn't exist. If All for One didn't have a quirk that created something similar, and if he had never come across a person for the Nomu project like Izuku, they would have no idea if vestiges could exist after a quirk left its user. And if there wasn't space made for a vestige, could one even manifest? What if the fact that I gave you your mother's quirk also played a factor? Could your mother's DNA have made assimilation easier? All for One paused. I seem to have lost track of the conversation at hand. I apologize, Tamura. At the sound of his name, he straightened. Yes, sensei? What quirk do you believe would complement this Nomu's existing arsenal? Izuku inhaled sharply. No, he couldn't seriously mean to give Izuku another quirk? Even with Inko containing her quirk for him, Izuku still felt like he was only a few meters away from being as loopy and unresponsive as before. He wasn't meant to handle another quirk. He didn't know if having another one added would fully override his consciousness, and he didn't want to find out. Organs don't weigh that much, Inko had told him. Izuku didn't realize he would be putting her advice into practice so soon. Sensei, Tamura said. I wasn't thinking about a match when I decided to get rid of his mother's quirk, but thinking about adding something to harmonize his quirks could be useful, wouldn't you agree? What if he can't handle another quirk, Sensei? Tamura asked, desperation edging into his voice. All for One's tone turned cold, the smile on his face more unnerving than before. Your concern is unwarranted, Tamura. All the Nomu subjects' bodies managed to survive another quirk. And your friend's unusual recovery only bolsters my reasoning to give him an additional quirk. Those things aren't alive, Tamura burst. Sure, they have a pulse, but they died. Tamura, All for One growled. All for One? Izuku spoke loudly, desperate to turn All for One's attention away from Tamura. Is that anything like One for All? Izuku's whole body trembled as an eerie silence swept the room. All for One slowly turned back to Izuku, no longer smiling. What did you say? Terror left him unable to speak, but All for One had not expected an answer from him. Tendrils shot from his hand and wrapped around Izuku so tightly he could feel his bones grinding together. He pulled Izuku in close, holding him off the ground. You know about One for All? Fuck, he only meant to distract him, not set off his murder impulse. Izuku nodded, a wheeze getting crushed out of him when the tendrils held him tighter in response. Are you? He trailed off, shaking his head. No, you are not 9. I would have felt my brother's power inside you. Izuku was brought closer. But you know who is, don't you? All for One said, a smile stretching across his face again. Tell me, Nomu, who did All Might pass my brother's power to? Who did entrust his legacy to? Oh, this was bad. This was definitely the guy that put All Might through the ringer. What would he do to Mirio, given the opportunity? Izuku couldn't just give him up. Against any of the self-preservation he had learned from his family. Izuku stayed silent as he dangled in All for One's grasp. It's fine that you are not the chatty type, All for One said. All of you hero types break the same way, in the end. Pain seeped into his bones, invading his system, and Izuku clamped down on the urge to scream. No matter what All for One did to him, Izuku refused to give up his friend. Agony mounted inside of him until he could barely manage a coherent thought. Izuku faintly thought that this was a decent way to die, for a friend. The pain receded, leaving Izuku shaky. Who is 9? Izuku stayed quiet. The only thing keeping Tamura from lunging at Sensiri had placed on his shoulder. Kurogiri, Sensei said over Izuku's sounds of pain. Could you go escort our guests back to their own facility? It seems our deal will be falling through. Guests? What guests? Kurogiri transported them into a different room, where 2 people resided. Dragon, Rappa, Kurogiri addressed. The deal is off. The man with dark hair shot to his feet, his expression twisting with rage. You said? Something has come up, Kurogiri interrupted. We will contact you if something changes. Before they could argue or fight, Kurogiri warped them away. Who were those NPCs? He asked. They were members of the Shi Hasaikai, a Yakuza organization, Kurogiri explained. They struck a bargain with the doctor. They give us a few more additions to the league in exchange for Izuku. What? Tamura cried out. Why didn't you say anything while we were planning? The details of our negotiations were still being hammered out. By the time the trade would have taken place, we would have already been gone. Kurogiri sighed. I did not know Izuku would have information that set Sensei off as he did. At the reminder of what Izuku was going through, Tamura felt a familiar rage swarm him. Less familiar but just as warranted. Guilt smothered him. Tamura was the reason Izuku was getting hurt again. If he had just found a better way to contact Izuku, none of them would be in this mess. You already sent the heroes their clue, right? Tamura gritted his teeth. Stupid heroes. They should have done their jobs better and kept him away. The win at UA's summer training camp was Pyrrhic. The league had gained reputation points, but now Izuku was at risk. He was being hurt and all Tamura could do was wait until those lousy heroes launched their plan. Yes, Kurogiri said. They should be arriving anytime now. Izuku's nerves screamed at the painful stimulation all for one flooded into him when he refused to answer his questions again. Both of the existing quirks inside of him were useless without mobility or contact, neither of which Izuku possessed. I don't really need you to answer me, I suppose, All for One said, mulling over his options. That number one buffoon would probably blurt their name if I riled him up enough. A tendril slowly curled around his neck. So, I will ask you one more time, Midoriya Izuku. Who is 9? The wall exploded. The tendrils loosened, and Izuku was engulfed in dark mist. He fell into someone's arms, a gentle grip forming around his overly sensitive body. Are you okay? Tamura asked urgently. The doctor's been taken care of, the heroes are here, and Ragdoll was returned. Izuku used what little strength he had left to press himself into Tamura. His whole body shook violently with tremors, the aftershock of pain needling at his nerves. Tamura's arms slowly wrapped around him. His touch hurt, the weight of his arms overbearing, but Izuku needed it. He didn't care that it hurt, only that someone was with him. We must move, Kurogiri said, breaking Izuku's bubble of safety. Can you walk? Izuku pulled away from Tamura and tried to stand, but it was like he was a baby deer taking its first steps. Tamura simply picked him up and they stepped through another portal. Izuku allowed himself to hang limply in his arms, grateful for the lack of tendrils crushing him. Taking in trembling breaths, Izuku slowly attempted to regain his composure. We're dropping you off at the black slime burst from Izuku's mouth, choking him while it enveloped him. He faintly heard Tamura screaming, but the sound vanished as he was spat out onto rubble. Izuku muffled a scream as he skidded across the broken ground. The adrenaline that faded came rushing back into his system. Every movement as he pushed himself to his feet was agony, but he managed to gain a brief assessment of the situation before dodging concrete flung by the fight between All Might and All for One. The rest of the league appeared one by one via the black slime. Tamura and Kurogiri appeared last, Tamura violently thrashing against the slime until it fully disappeared. Their eyes met across the field of destruction and, for a moment, Izuku saw overwhelming relief in his eyes. Then something wrapped around his midsection and he was yanked off the ground. He flailed and frantically pulled at the thing wrapped around him until Izuku realized how familiar it was. His body collided with a dark figure and he was being carried far, far away from the league and All for One. Izuku clung to Aizawa until they stopped, and then he held on tighter with his meager strength. Izuku, Aizawa said softly, his hand carding through Izuku's sweat-damp hair. He shuddered at the contact, burrowing himself further into Aizawa's shoulder. Izuku, I need to know if you're okay or not. Fine, Izuku said into his jumpsuit, just want to go home. And sleep, he amended, he could really use some sleep. Izuku closed his eyes and let himself drift off. According to one of the nurses on hand with a particular quirk, Izuku had been tortured. Of course, she hadn't phrased it like that, but Hitoshi could read between the lines. Technically he shouldn't be listening to the conversation, but he needed to know what Izuku had gone through. He needed to know how to help him when he woke up. Hitoshi had been so useless the entire time he was gone, and he couldn't stand it. He could have helped when the league attacked the training camp, but instead, he stayed inside the lodge, waiting for him to return. And while Izuku was in the league's clutches, he just sat in his room, waiting for news on Izuku's rescue. Now, Izuku was finally here and Hitoshi could find a way to do something other than wait around. His heart monitor beeped steadily and Hitoshi was reminded of the aftermath of the USJ. Here he was, sitting beside Izuku. listening in on a conversation he wasn't supposed to hear. It was the middle of the night this time, and he had no doubt the Hatsumes would be arriving soon. Nearly a week had passed in Izuku's absence and none of them had fared very well during that time. His classmates were despondent and Hitoshi hadn't spoken to Mei or her mothers at all. His dads were working themselves to the bone trying to find Izuku. The officer that leaked Izuku's information was found and dealt with viciously by Nedzu's lawyers. Nedzu insisted on dealing with all of the rumors regarding Izuku's position with the League. He ravaged every news station slandering Izuku's name and pushed out things in support of Izuku's innocence. Still, Hitoshi felt like throttling someone, and Shigaraki was high up on that list. Only Shigaraki and Kurogiri managed to escape Kamino Ward and they were mostly forgotten in the aftermath of All Might's final stand. The door opened, and his pops stepped inside. The Hatsumes stepped in after him, piling into the room. They greeted each other quietly, then took their places around Izuku. None of them spoke, simply basking in the fact that they had Izuku again. Mitsu and Ayumi stared at Izuku's unconscious body and wept quietly in relief, hugging their daughter between them. Pops put his arm around Hitoshi and released a heavy, shaking sigh, a few stray tears rolling down his face. Sometime in the morning, his dad entered the room, completing their family reunion. Hitoshi dozed on Pop's shoulder until the moment Izuku's heart monitor began beeping much faster than before. They all became alert as Izuku slowly woke up, holding their breaths as he opened his eyes. "Hi," he said, smiling. "Could you repeat that?" Detective Tsukachi asked. Aizawa was looking at him with disbelief, too. Izuku shifted in his hospital bed. "It was cold here. I said that Tamura and Kurogiri made a plan with me to get me back to the heroes." He wondered why that was such an unbelievable thing, considering the detective finished X about one for all to Izuku just a little bit before he started to question Izuku. Both of the adults in the room shared a skeptical glance with each other. "But they were the ones to kidnap you in the first place. Why would they want to just let you go?" "Because they didn't want me to get hurt," Izuku said. "All for One wanted to keep giving me quirks because of how I adjusted to having Inkos." Izuku paused as some of the static in his head increased, as if the quirk heard him talking about it. "I don't think I would have stayed so sound of mind though." "Could you elaborate on the details of the plan you made?" Izuku did. He told them about the tip given to the police, the doctor, how things went awry when All for One asked to see them. He started asking Tamura what quirk he thought would complement the ones I already had. "Of course, I knew that I wouldn't be able to." He gritted his teeth and tried to steady himself. Tamura knew it, too. He started arguing with him. All for One was getting mad. Izuku started shaking, a sob building in his chest. "I didn't know what else to do, I swear, detective. But he was going to hurt Tamura and I didn't know how else to stop him." "Hayama," he said calmly, "take a deep breath. I'm not going to get angry with you." Izuku listened, even though his ribs ached with the feeling of his lungs pressing against them, and nodded once he calmed down. "Now, what did you do when he started to get mad?" "I asked him if All for One was like One for All," Izuku whispered, looking at his lap instead of at the detective's face. "And what happened after that?" "It worked," Izuku said, wet chuckles quietly coming out with the words. "He forgot all about Tamura. Started asking me about 9. He knew there were signs of what All for One did to him. His whole body ached from being squeezed and he could see the bruises on his arms. That meant they probably knew, too." "I didn't tell him anything," he said softly, "not a thing." The rest of the questions went by faster after that. Or maybe he was just a little out of it. He made sure to emphasize how much Tamura and Kurogiri helped him anytime they came up. And every time he did, his words made Aizawa and the detective increasingly uncomfortable. He knew that they were still villains and that they had done horrible things, but they weren't just killers to him. They were the people who cared about him when he needed to be cared for, the people who kept him going for all those lonely years. Detective Tsukachi thanked them both and stepped out, Aizawa following him out. Izuku listened to their voices through the wall, their words muffled and lost through the barrier. Aizawa came back in, taking the spot where Detective Tsukachi had been sitting. "When can we go home?" Izuku asked, longing to see the cats again. Aizawa sighed. "Soon, Izuku. But, first, we need to talk." "About what?" "About Shigaraki and Kurogiri. You know that they are bad people, right?" Though agreeing gave him a sense of betrayal and the description didn't really fit to him, Izuku nodded. I know. And you know that your family does not like them at all because of what they've done to you. They saved me, Izuku shouted, suddenly furious. They saved me. Aizawa didn't react to his outburst. They were the ones who took you in the first place, he said. They have been the cause of a lot of your pain. They kept me alive, Izuku snarled. Even after they left me alone, they were the reason I kept going for so long. They made you feel like you had to suppress your quirk, Aizawa argued. They allowed you to be experimented on. They gave me hope, Izuku shouted, frustrated. They kidnapped you twice. They had your mother killed. They hurt you. At the mention of Inko, Izuku scowled. Muscular killed Inko, and if he was ordered to do it, then it wasn't by Kurogiri. And it wasn't like Tamura, who was a kid at the time, could have done it either. He thought about the scar on his right shoulder, where Tamura's hand had pressed into him, leaving him bloody in a fit of rage. Tamura wanted me to be his friend again, that's why he kidnapped me. Because he's a criminal, Aizawa reminded him. He had you kidnapped because he is a criminal who has no qualms killing, who tried to kill me and your classmates more than once. I know, Izuku said, tears surfacing. I know that they aren't good people. I know that they hurt me and you and that they've done things that should never be done. But they were good to me and they helped me find my way here, even if it was just their memory. Aizawa gave himself pause, sighing. What do you mean? I hung out at Dagoba Beach for years because I was so desperate to just catch a glimpse of them again. I never would have gotten into building support items if I hadn't spent so much time just sitting around fiddling with things. I never would have started selling all that junk to the Hatsumes, meaning I would never have met them. And if I didn't sell all of it, I wouldn't have gotten the money that I needed for the tuition. Maybe I would have found some other way to get in, Izuku conceded, but I might not have. And then I never would have met you or Pops or Hitoshi. I would still be in that empty apartment, alone. You can't give them credit for your happiness, Aizawa said firmly. It was your actions that led you here, not theirs. Maybe Kurogiri should have just let me bleed out on that beach, Izuku said bitterly. It would have saved us all a lot of trouble. No, Aizawa snapped, surprising Izuku with his vehemence. Never think that way. I don't care how much trouble you are. You being happy and safe in the end is worth every last ounce of stress. Aizawa offered his hand and Izuku placed his hand in his dad's palm. They sat in silence for several minutes. Izuku didn't like that his thoughts had taken that sort of direction. Thoughts like that had stopped haunting him a few weeks after meeting the Hatsumes, disappearing so long ago that he managed to forget he used to think like that. But here he was, regretting his own happiness because he brought trouble to the people, making him think that life had more to it than a goal in getting there. UA is implementing a dorm system when all the students come back. It means we're going to start living on campus, Aizawa said. The staff is making rounds to ask for parent permission. I spoke to Ayumi and Mitsu with Hizashi about you, Mei, and Hitoshi's living situation. But can't you just give your own permission? Izuku asked, perplexed. You're our dads, aren't you? Your father and I may be your parents, but that doesn't mean that we want to just make you move into dorms without providing you with other options. Mitsu and Ayumi have offered their house to you too if you want to step away from UA. There is no pressure to make either choice. We will love you either way. Away from UA? Izuku said incredulously. You think Hitoshi and I would ever take that? No, he said bluntly, but there's no sense in not giving you a choice about it. Izuku liked having pull a little more than he anticipated. It was so useful for the most mundane things. No one looked at him funny for using it, either. No one feared it. No one thought he was a villain for lifting his notebook into a box. They were finishing packing up all the things they wanted to take with them. The cats were coming with them, thank God. No one in the class had an allergy and Mitsu and Ayumi offered to take them, but Izuku knew that they would have killed each other very quickly if they were contained in the same house. The Hatsume house was not a place for pets, and the cats would not have appreciated living with strangers. They arrived at the dorms early in Taiwan else because of their dad's staff positions. Hitoshi and Izuku had rooms right next to each other, which Izuku found reassuring. Izuku and Hitoshi decided to hang out together after they managed to move all their boxes. Hitoshi sat against the headboard of Izuku's bed and Izuku laid on the bed while they talked. I'm tired, Izuku yawned. He closed his eyes and made a fake snore. Mood, Hitoshi said, but if you're tired, you should sleep. Izuku shook his head. Dad said he wanted to have everyone in class meet up outside the building later. I promise you, Dad will not mind you skipping out if you're sleeping. Izuku hesitated. Just wake me up when he calls us, he bargained. Sleep, Hitoshi said, grabbing one of his many blankets and throwing it over Izuku. The blanket was yellow and had a bunch of chibi present mics yelling or saying, yeah. Izuku snuggled into it and closed his eyes. Izuku jolted awake at a loud thump. Blearily, he fought his way out of his blanket, nearly tripping himself as he stepped away from the bed. He checked the time on the clock by his bed and grumbled to himself as he rubbed at his eyes. Hitoshi had not woken him up. He left his room and realized that everyone else must be inside their own, decorating and renovating. Izuku walked down the hall until he reached the door and then he walked around some more. He had no idea who was in which room, so he headed down to the kitchen. There were snacks somewhere and he was going to find them. Sitting on the counter, Izuku munched on some chips, swinging his legs back and forth. He listened to footsteps come closer and closer until Sato came into view, humming something to himself. Sato stopped dead when he made eye contact with Izuku. Izuku crunched another chip before dusting off his fingers and getting off the counter. Hi, Izuku said when Sato didn't stop staring at him. H. Can I hug you? Sato interrupted, arms twitching as he waited for Izuku's reply. Izuku nodded and Sato's large arms enveloped him. His feet left the ground as he stood to his full height with Izuku in his arms. Izuku hugged him back as he dangled. You scared us, man, Sato said quietly. Sorry, Izuku mumbled into his shoulder. Not your fault, Sato said. Eventually, Izuku's feet met the ground again and he found out that Sato had come into the kitchen to take stock of the cabinet space and what the appliances were like. You should go see Todoroki when you can, Sato suggested. He's been pretty anxious to see you. Not that all of us aren't, but he was really freaked out when you were gone. Guilt crawled over him like a million ants. He should have thought about getting in contact with him, with all of his friends. Do you know where his room is? Sato paused. I think so, hold on. A few minutes later, Izuku was knocking on what he hoped was Shoto's dorm room. The noise coming from inside the room stopped and the door opened. Shoto stood completely still as he realized who was in front of him. Izuku offered him a sheepish smile and extended his arms in an invitation. Shoto grabbed one of his arms and pulled him into his room, shaking hands pulling him into a fiercely tight hug as he stepped over the threshold. Izuku pressed back with just as much enthusiasm, shoving down the instinctive panic that the tight hold brought. Izuku had so much bad luck when it came to things squeezing him, and all for one's chosen method of torture was an added traumatic experience. He ought to have some form of good associating instead of just avoiding it entirely. Like exposure therapy. Because he loved being hugged by the people he loved. The Hatsumes were huggers, and though they were being careful with him, that wasn't going to change. He also knew that Shoto would never hurt him. He was just worried, just happy to see him again. Izuku tried not to think about the time in All for One's clutches when he was robbed of his senses through pain. He had never gotten the chance to think that he might never be able to see his family again. He could barely remember most of the events that took place between his capture and receiving pull. Things cleared up after his weird mind communication with her, but they got fuzzier the closer he came to All for One's questioning. Still, Izuku knew when to pull away. His nerves were fraying and he had to forcibly calm himself down. Shoto fretted over him, but Izuku waved him off. I'm fine, he reassured him, just a little sore. Shoto practically forced him to sit down on his bed, muttering about letting himself recover. Izuku took in the half-done transformation of the room, impressed with how much he managed to get done. Are you going for a traditional look? Izuku asked as Shoto wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. I suppose, he hummed in response. This is what my home looks like. How did Endeavor take the whole dorm thing? Shoto shrugged. He was more preoccupied with All Might's retirement. He'll never get to beat him now. Izuku winced. And you? He grabbed Shoto's hand, winding their fingers together. Do you think you'll like the dorms? Yes, he said immediately. I think I will. The Hero Commission accelerated their course, saying that their world was going to need more heroes because of All Might's sudden retirement. The provisional license exam was approaching fast, so everyone in his class worked hard to advance themselves and come up with special moves. Izuku had a whole new quirk to deal with and learn about, so he had options. One of them involved messing with his glitter gun again so that it could rapidly fire different types of ammo. Another involved learning how to use Inko's quirk like a bullfighter would wave a red cape to guide the bull around. He would pull an object towards him at a high speed and then release it. Of course, he tried to aim it, but he had a lot of bruises from objects just slamming into him. One time, he actually managed to knock himself out. His body still felt weirdly full all the time. A fog kept at bay by Inko on the edges of his mind, but he was adjusting. Sometimes he would just feel out an object to see what he could pull on. A cap on a water bottle, the string of a bag, a screw in the vents. He could pull on them without flinging the whole mass they were connected to at himself. Mei and him had fun with that, testing out what he could accomplish with his quirk. Their parents kept suggesting they take up the help of a quirk counselor, but then they might have to worry about things like safety and laws, so they decided against that. Izuku was also certain that Mei injected a tracker into him at some point, but whatever. Yagi asked for a private meeting after heroics class ended and Izuku agreed hesitantly. Detective Tsukachi probably told him about what transpired between him and All for One, and Yagi wanted to talk about it. What there was to say, Izuku didn't know. Was he going to get scolded for using One for All as a diversion? For putting Mirio at risk? They sat across from each other, their tea cooling on the table between them. Yagi cleared his throat, then stood and bowed deeply. I wanted to say thank you. Izuku blue screened, blindsided by the sheer amount of gratitude Yagi was exuding. At his silence, Yagi simply continued, guilt dripping from every word. Detective Tsukachi told me what you did for young Mirio. Thank you for protecting him, even when you were faced with such a formidable enemy. Did you know he was alive? Izuku blurted, a burning question begging for the right answer. All for One, he clarified as Yagi rose. Did you know he was alive when you gave Mirio One for All? Say no, he asked silently. Please say no, Yagi hurried to reply, panic flashing across his face. No, I assure you. I thought I had killed him, he frowned, taking his seat again. I promised myself long ago that I would be the face him. Thank God, Izuku said, deflating against the couch. How is Mirio, anyway? Yagi brightened, starting to talk about his successor's training and improvements with One for All and permeation. Izuku listened, glad that Mirio was doing so well. Yagi paused in his rambling, a more serious expression forming. Do you plan to tell young Mirio? Izuku shook his head. I have nightmares about it. I don't see why I should unload all that onto Mirio. My boy, he started, then cut himself off. He would want to know, he said. It's your choice, of course, but he would want to know. The exam was finally here. The air in the bus vibrated with his class's energy, nervous or otherwise. Today they would see if they were up to snuff, if their training paid off. When they arrived and stepped out of the bus, students from other schools were greeting them almost immediately. One kid from Ketsubutsu zeroed in on Izuku and stepped into Izuku's space, grabbing his hands. He said something, but it was drowned out by the feeling of his hands around Izuku's. He hated it. He hated it. They squeezed tighter. He leaned in closer. Izuku wanted him to go away. He wanted him to stop doing this to him. His hands were released and Izuku's head cleared somewhat. He glanced to his sides, unable to look at Shindo without making the shaking in his hands worse. What he saw made the shaking nearly vanish. Behind him, standing firm and looking like nightmares in their school uniforms, were his classmates. If looks could kill, Shindo would be dead 19 times over. Yaoyorozu stepped forward and somewhat in front of Izuku, glaring fiercely at the students that were looking in their direction, their gazes drawn by the sheer amount of intimidation his classmates managed to amass. Whoa, what's the big deal? Shindo said, still playing nice. I just wanted to give you all a warm welcome. Touch him again, Yaoyorozu began, the ice in her voice practically causing a chill, and we will give you a welcome of our own. By the time Shindo had the sense to back off, Izuku had been shuffled into the middle of their class pack. Aizawa stepped out of the bus, took one look at them, and then turned to Tsuyu. Yaoyorozu was still preoccupied, focusing on drilling holes into the backs of people's heads with her eyes. A particularly large student from Shikstu looked like he was going to get too close, and his classmates managed to sway his judgment, the combined power of their gazes apparently too menacing to brave. Just being friendly, ribbit. Aizawa grinned in answer, all teeth and tired eyes. Izuku didn't know what the crushing of Ua was, but he felt like the name was pretty self-explanatory. Izuku's head ached. Inko's power took a toll on his brain, not unlike the times he overused his quirk. Those who passed had moved on to the rescue portion of the exam, and he worked tirelessly with his classmates and the other students to get the civilians to the safe zone. Izuku volunteered to go deeper into the city ruins and searched for civilians using his sight. He just finished checking over 2 of the civilians when a cry for help came from another street over. Turning to the pair in front of him, Izuku pointed them towards the safe zone. Neither of you have serious injuries that impair you. The safe zone is that way, can you make it there on your own? As soon as they said yes, he was off, vaulting over broken pieces of the street and towards the source of the screams. An aura lay in the back of an alley, the actual person obscured by light. Izuku approached quickly and knelt beside the small figure lying in the corner. He was small like the rest of the acting civilians, but he looked completely different in terms of appearance. His body was completely covered in some sort of black suit, a white mask covering his face. "Are you alright?" The person turned over, revealing a bird-like face as the mosque's design. "Surge," he said, an odd bit of glee in his voice. He shifted quickly, injecting something small into himself. Izuku caught a glimpse of red before he refocused his attention. "Yeah," Izuku said, "and I'm here to help. Are you hurt anywhere?" The person disappeared. What? No, he had melted in the ground. The ground rolled underneath him, knocking him off his feet. Was this part of the test? "Your father has been waiting, Midoriya," the man told him. The way the ground was moving changed, leaving him to crash into a wall headfirst. Izuku lost his meager breakfast as he tumbled constantly, knocking his head into the walls. "Midoriya," he said. "Midoriya?" This was not part of the test. This was a villain. In a moment of balance, Izuku managed to fire a flare. In the next moment, his hand cracked against the wall, sending his gun flying and breaking something in his hand. "Don't worry, Midoriya," said a voice from nowhere. It came from the walls as they closed in around him. The floor as it threw him off balance constantly, disorienting him. "We are going to cure you soon." Shoto was about to attack Gang Orca when he saw it. A green flare lit up the sky, shot from somewhere inside the city. Izuku. It was the same flare he sent up when Stain was about to kill Iida and Native. Without a thought for what might happen to his score by leaving Gale Force to deal with Gang Orca on his own, Shoto was skating into the city. "Todoroki." He turned at the sound of Iida's voice. He was rushing with the same urgency as Shoto was. "You saw it, too?" he asked, scanning every inch they passed for any sign of Izuku. "I did," he said. He wouldn't have sent that up without proper reason. They turned a corner and felt tremors in the ground. Sharing a glance, they both increased their speeds. "You're faster," Shoto said. "Go ahead, I'll catch up." Recipro extending away, Shoto was about to follow when he saw Izuku's gun. The firearm was laying in an oddly deformed alley. Now that he was looking, the whole street seemed oddly deformed. The rubble was different, like it had been rearranged somehow. Shoto followed the pattern down the following streets, the tremors in the ground elevating. All of the tremors stopped. Shoto found Iida kneeling beside Izuku, frantically saying his name as he took stock of his injuries. He knelt down on Izuku's other side, taking inventory of the odd angles his hand was making, the blood oozing down his face, the remains of vomit around his mouth. "What happened?" Iida asked, frowning in his anger. "Is there another villain in the area, like Gang Orca?" At his words, Shoto stood and scanned the area. Aside from the way the ground was formed, nothing else was off. No one was approaching them or fighting them. It was as if they decided to just beat Izuku and leave. They stood there for another minute before the end of the exam was announced. As Iida rushed Izuku away to find an infirmary, but Shoto made his way back to Gang Orca, seething with rage. He almost knocked into him when he caught up to him. "How is beating someone senseless part of a test?" he snarled. "Who is it? Which hero? A test? They beat his best friend for the sake of a test. Maybe this was supposed to be realistic. Maybe they were supposed to act their parts as villains, but why would they only target Izuku? Why go after him so viciously?" Gang Orca startled at his anger, surprise filtering into his expression. "What? Which hero decided it was okay to beat my friend up until he passed out? Shoto snapped, his jaw hurting with how hard he ground his teeth. I don't see how that can be productive for anyone. Where was he? He was alone. He was on the outskirts of the ruins, rescuing the civilians. No one should have been out there, he muttered. Gang Orca shouted to get his sidekick's attention. Everyone, I need a sweep of the area. Possible intruders on site. Shoto blinked as the sidekicks forming groups and running back out into the ruins. Gang Orca turned back to him, putting his large fin-like hands on Shoto's shoulders. Do you have any more details about what happened? No, he shook his head. When we found him he was already out cold, no one else was around. The flare that you ran to, he started, nodding in the direction where Izuku's flare flew into the sky. Was that him? Yes, alright, go find your friend. He paused. Ignore the test scores for now. Oh, right. He probably failed after they saw him abandon that boy while fighting Gang Orca. Shoto made his way through the throng of students, eventually being pointed to the infirmary. Large as it was, he was still able to pick out the small group of people around Izuku's bed. Yamazawa's bright hair, Aizawa's dark attire, Iida's broad form. Iida told us what happened, Aizawa said when he stopped at Izuku's bedside. No villains or civilians had been placed in that area of the ruins. The implications hung heavily in the air. If there wasn't anyone meant to be there, that meant a real villain managed to sneak into a facility crawling with heroes and alike. Will he be okay? Shoto said, not knowing what else to ask. Yamazawa nodded, his frown a harsh, bitter thing. They say he's got a concussion, bruises, and some broken bones. No permanent damage. Shoto scowled. It didn't matter that none of his injuries would heal, what mattered was that he got them in the first place. He should have been worrying about passing an exam, not fighting for his life. His classmates were congregated by the bus when they arrived, lively and exuberant, brandishing their provisional licenses in their hands. Their energy quickly dissipated as Aizawa explained the situation. They all boarded the bus, feeling incomplete without Izuku in his rightful place beside them. Yamazawa would stay behind with him in the infirmary, waiting until President Mike arrived to take them both back to the dorms. Somber and agitated, Shoto waited in the common room until Yamazawa and Izuku walked in. During that time, one of the cats crawled into his lap. Late as it was, Shoto had to turn on the lamp that was nearby for them to notice him in the dark room. I've been expecting you, he said, petting the cat's head as he turned on the lamp. Yamazawa shrieked, jumping into the air. Izuku was bandaged and exhausted, but he still managed to double over in wheezing laughter. Shoto looked between them, Yamazawa clutching his shirt as he regained his calm and Izuku pressing the hand in a cast to his face, still shaking with laughter. What? You're too good, Izuku said, plopping down beside him. Hi, Tora. He scratched behind the cat's ears, earning a purr. Shoto opened his mouth to ask for more details, but Yamazawa caught his gaze and shook his head slowly as Izuku leaned into his side, sinking into the couch beside him. Later, he mouthed. Shoto nodded. You failed, by the way, Yamazawa informed him. That blonde guy said we should tell you. That's fine, he said, and he meant it. Izuku's well-being was far more important than acquiring a fancy piece of plastic. He could go to the remedial classes in the coming months. Sorry, Izuku muttered against his shoulder. For getting attacked? Shoto asked. No, Izuku huffed. For making you fail, he clarified. Yamazawa looked like he had something to say about that, but Shoto said something before he could. I can pass the test later, he assured him. But, to be clear, I would gladly fail it again if it meant your safety. Izuku pressed his face into Shoto's shoulder and made a strangled sound before sitting up and clearing his throat. I'm going to bed. As he walked out of the room, Yamazawa smirked. You'd gladly fail it again, huh? He said before walking away, too. Yes. That's what he said, wasn't it? Maybe he should go find Izuku and say it again, just to be sure he understood. I'm getting real tired of this, Izuku said as the machines around him beeped shrilly, making his headache worse. Another day, another hospital, it seemed. What happened this time? Run it by him again? Weren't they supposed to be getting ready for the second part of the exam? You and me both, Shinso responded, not needing Izuku to clarify what he meant. The HPSC sends their regards. And a terrible gift basket. What does it have in it? Lots of things, like a rule book for hero-ly conduct, a book on villain origins, how to handle a crowd. He paused, grabbing one and then brandishing it to Izuku, smiling. Oh, and let's not forget, fighting the evil within. What a load of crap. Man, they were kind of on the nose with that one. I know, if they want to tell you they're worried about a change in your career path. I feel like there are more subtle ways to go about it. Is there any food? Sweets? No, they conned us. Gave us a damn library and called it a day. Not even a protein bar or something? Hitoshi shook his head. Izuku clicked his tongue. Cheapskates. I'm here, Yamada shouted, startling Izuku with how loud and frantic he was. I'm here, oh my god, Izuku, your face. I know, I'm gorgeous. He tried to flip his hair with his hand but quickly realized his hand was in a cast and settled for simply continuing the motion. What happened? Izuku looked to Hitoshi, who he found staring at him imploringly. What? We don't really know what happened, they just found him all beat up. Hitoshi looked back at Izuku. We were hoping you would be able to tell us. Oh, Izuku said. I don't know. I don't actually remember much after the point that they released us into the second part of the exam. Nothing? Yamada asked. Izuku shook his head. They left shortly after Yamada spoke with some of the employees and Izuku was falling asleep on Hitoshi's shoulder on the way back to the dorms. Finding Shoto still awake with Tora in his lap was a pleasant surprise. Curling up on his warm half had only served to make him more sleepy. Shoto managed to wake him up though, flustering him and reminding him that he should probably go to bed. Izuku stared at the ceiling, eyes refusing to stay closed. His body ached from his injuries and whatever medication they dosed him with in the infirmary was started to wear off. He sighed and prepared for a long night. Izuku was going to intern with Nighteye. Work studies were coming up and Nighteye invited him to his agency through Mirio again. When he arrived at Nighteye's agency, he explained that he wanted to give Izuku a proper experience in how an agency is run. Izuku agreed, partially because he didn't know who to trust in the hero industry and he didn't want to be doxxed again. His skin crawled when he stood too close to Mirio. All for One's voice slithered through his head and phantom tendrils wrapped around his body as he whispered his question. Who is 9? Izuku wanted it to be over. He wanted to be able to talk to Mirio without all the stupid baggage he had making his hands shake. Logically, he knew that All for One was not going to just pop out of the shadows and kill them, but paranoia kept him on edge. What if someone figured out who Mirio was through their interactions and told All for One? What if he wasn't being inconspicuous enough? Was it even right of him to be near Mirio since All for One knew about his connection to 9? Izuku shook himself, clenching his jaw. He wanted to be Mirio's friend. All for One was in Tartarus. The league basically dissolved and the residual cronies were being hunted down. He knew that. So why couldn't he look Mirio in the eyes? When Izuku stepped out of the car and closed the door, Hitoshi made an offended noise and got out, too. You're coming inside? Izuku said curiously, trying Tay would want to come inside Nighteye's agency. When he got in the car with Izuku, he just thought that he was seeing him off like Aizawa was. Well, yeah, he said dryly. I'm going to ask to be one of his work-study students. What? Izuku shouted in excitement. Really, wouldn't be here if I didn't plan on it. He flicked Izuku on the forehead, a cheeky smile on his face. Plus, who knows what kind of trouble you'll get into if I'm not around? Izuku pouted. Don't be mean. They waved goodbye to Aizawa and walked into the agency. The nervousness building at the thought of interacting with Mirio more often dissipated as Hitoshi's presence inserted itself into the scenarios he imagined. Nighteye raised an eyebrow when they both stepped into his office. Yamazawa, he said. I'd like to put in a request for a work study in your agency, Hitoshi said, straight to the point. Do you have the form? He saw Hitoshi keep himself from scoffing. As if he would forget the form. They both handed him their papers and Nighteye stamped them. Izuku wasn't entirely sure if he stamped Hitoshi's because he genuinely thought he would be a good addition to the team and actually mentor Hitoshi or if he was still trying to get on his family's good side. Izuku was ecstatic either way. You're coming with me, Izuku said for what must have been the 10th time. Yup, Hitoshi responded, I'm going with you. The first few hours of their first official day as work-study students flew by until Nighteye called them in to tell them about their patrols. They were doing surveillance. Watching out for the young leader of the Shi Hasaikai. Sir Nighteye pulled him aside when Bubble Girl and Hitoshi left. There are rumors circulating that they made contact with the League during your time in their clutches. He pursed his lips, watching Izuku carefully as he said, "We also have evidence that your father is an important member of the Shi Hasaikai. Could you go escort our guests back to their own facility? It seems our deal will be falling through." Izuku blinked once. Twice. The weird sensation disappeared. "That's not good. Mirio will be showing you the ropes of patrolling," Nighteye said slowly, still eyeing Izuku warily. "Go on." Their patrol started and Izuku gladly used Hitoshi as a buffer between himself and Mirio. They were entirely different people, but Hitoshi kept up banter with Mirio well enough that Izuku barely needed to chime in. His father was part of the group they were investigating, a major player in the Yakuza. That was where he went off to. He joined a gang. Strange emptiness filled his head as he thought back to all those times Inko would come back from her little trips with scorch marks on her things and alcohol on her breath. She had probably known. Those pockets of time that she left were for visiting him, weren't they? Did she just wait for him to call her and go running? "Your father has been waiting, Midoriya." They all patrolled. They were sometimes stopped by fans or minor crimes, but nothing outlandishly terrible happened to anyone, so Izuku took it as a win. They regrouped at the agency and the day ended. Mirio tried to make conversation with Izuku, but by then Hitoshi had figured out that Izuku was avoiding speaking directly to Mirio and actively standing between any real conversation between them. Mirio stopped him before he and Hitoshi could walk to their dorm building. "Hayama, do you have a minute?" Izuku couldn't break eye contact fast enough to formulate an excuse and ended up nodding. Mirio beamed and Izuku felt his heart banging against his rib cage, with blood roaring in his ears. Izuku followed Mirio off to the side, hoping that his friend couldn't hear how hard his heart was pounding. He could barely breathe while staring at his shoes, listening to Mirio saying something to him. If he looked him in the eye, would he stop breathing entirely? His chest tightened, reminiscent of All for One's suffocating grip. "I just want you to know that I'm here for you, okay?" Izuku blinked, finding himself back in the present. Thank you," he said, continuing to keep his gaze locked to the ground. Still, he could hear Mirio's smile in his voice when he said, "Of course." Inside the dorms, inside his room, Izuku curled into the mass of blankets on his bed. Sweltering in the heat he amassed, Izuku stayed put. Sweat clung to his sheets and his skin, but he didn't move other than to press further into his blankets. He sucked in quick breaths, tears gathering in the corners of his eyes as he tried to stuff all his panic into a box. "I'm here for you," Mirio said. His words made Izuku shudder because he couldn't even think about him without working himself into a panic attack. Izuku scratched at his skin, anger racing through him like a fire. Why couldn't everything just go back to normal? Why did he have to be like this now? "All for One is gone," Izuku muttered to himself in the quiet of his room, gasping between words. "All for One is gone, he's gone." But the number of times he said it didn't change anything in the end. No matter what he did, in these moments, he was always suffocating, struggling to find air, like he was still trapped in All for One's clutches. Like he never left. Izuku threw his blankets off of himself. Tried to, anyway. Everything was pressing in and he bit his lip to cut off a frustrated, panicked noise that no one needed to hear. He fought against the sheets he wrapped himself in and fell off the bed with a thud as he escaped. Cold air prickled his whole body, his sweat only making him colder with each passing second. He stood on wobbling knees and left his room on unsure feet. His thoughts realigned and Izuku found himself in front of a door with his knuckles pressed to the door as if he knocked. The door opened and Shoto stood across the threshold. Evidently, Izuku had knocked. "Izuku," Shoto said quietly. Izuku made a short sound in the back of his throat instead of the words he tried to say. "Sorry for waking you up. Sorry for being so needy. Sorry I can't handle this alone." Instead came some small, pathetic noise that had Shoto reaching for him in the next second. "Are you okay with touch?" he asked. Izuku nodded and he pulled him into his room by his hand. He laid on Shoto's futon and Izuku leaned into Shoto the moment he settled in beside him. "Do you just want to sleep? Or do you want to talk?" Izuku shifted further into Shoto's space, reveling in how pleasant his temperature was. When he didn't answer, Shoto just put his right arm over Izuku's body and pulled him closer. As Izuku finally drifted into something more peaceful than panicked, he heard Shoto say something. He didn't quite catch it. "Thank you for trusting me." Ayumi raised her eyebrows at Mitsu. "I want you to say that again, very carefully." Mitsu glanced at her wife, lost, and did as told. "I was looking for the order to fix the ice melting thingamajig in the warehouse and—" She stopped, looking even more confused. "Why was I looking in the warehouse? It would be in the garage, not the warehouse." Ayumi nodded and returned to her meal, satisfied, while Mitsu groaned and leaned her head on her hand. "I run a business," she said exasperatedly, "and I can't even remember how we organized our products." "That's why Ayumi handles the books, darling," Grandma said, giving her consoling back pats. "She isn't as enthralled by the mechanics and can remember things while you and May drive your competitors crazy." Mitsu's parents had come to visit after everything had calmed down. They were staying at the house and had recently gotten permission to take Izuku and May out for the night, provided they had a hero escort. Aizawa declined his grandfather's invitation to eat with them, preferring to remain undistracted and stealthy while the Izuku rambled on about his new work study and May boasted her inventions proudly. "You should have seen his face when my baby did exactly what I said it'd do." Him being May's current supervisor at her own internship. "And it didn't even sputter, ha. He thought it was going to explode in his face, but no, I'm the best and—" "Well, you did say it had a 63% chance of overheating and—" May's hand thrust out and hit him in the face without her even glancing at him. "I'm the best," she declared as he removed her hand from his face. Dinner carried on without a hitch. The restaurant was too fancy for Izuku to be there, honestly, but his family ignored any sense of decorum that was appropriate for a place like this, so he didn't feel too out of place following their example. People looked at them funny, but they looked at all of them funny, so Izuku could find humor in it. Grandpa held the door open for all of them to exit, some leftovers in their hands as they continued to chatter and laugh together. They all piled into the car, things quieting a bit as a lull in conversation rolled into a comforting silence. "You all okay back there?" Grandma asked, turning in her seat to look back at them. Izuku was sitting on the floor and the rest of them were all being crammed onto the backseat. Ayumi and Mitsu were rather large, though Ayumi was definitely taking up more space, and it didn't help that the car wasn't made without May's flailing gestures in mind. Izuku had to dodge a few times to avoid getting smacked in the face again. "We can throw Mitsu in the trunk if you need more room." Ayumi made an odd sound, her version of a stifled laugh, as Mitsu scoffed offendedly. "Betrayed by my own mother," she lamented, "laughed at by my wife and children. How will I?" The ground rumbled, rocking the car. Other drivers around them were just as shocked, muffled shrieks coming from the inside of other cars. Tires screeched on the asphalt and horns blared, but Izuku was preoccupied with the light and smoke coming from somewhere far away. Had that been an explosion? Aizawa knocked on Grandpd's window and all of them screamed. "Jesus, kid! You'll give us a heart attack," he berated, scowling at Aizawa. "Go on, what do you want?" "Just making sure you're all fine. Drive straight to Ua." Yeah, he grumbled, rolling up his window. "Looks like we're cutting tonight short," he said to the rest of them. Izuku's shoulders slumped and he didn't see May's hand before it hit him in the face as she used him as a to get closer to their grandparents. "You can just come into Ua with us," she suggested. "I can show you all of my babies, I have loads of them to show you. I bet half of them won't explode." "Won't it be a bit late?" Mitsu asked, glancing at her phone. "Will your teachers even let us into the support building?" "Doesn't matter," May said confidently, sinking back into her original place squished between her parents. Preening, she smirked, "I stole Majima-sensei's keys." "Hatsume May!" Mitsu shouted indignantly, swatting at her. Grandma just started cackling. She had an old witch, evil lady laugh that always set off Izuku, so naturally, he burst into a fit of giggles. "Why would you do that?" she despaired. "I need to get in there sometimes. And it can't wait until morning." No, Izuku had psyched himself out for today's patrol with Mirio. He was going to hold a conversation with him. Hitoshi knew about the plan and would be there in case Izuku messed up. But he wouldn't. He was going to look Mirio in the eye and actually talk and Izuku, Yamazawa, oh no, it's all good. He's chill. No panic, just saying hi to a friend. Mirio. His voice cracked horribly. This is it. This is where he dies. He's dead. Here lies Hayama Izuku, who died because he can't handle eye contact. Mirio's face looked just the same as the last time he looked at it, but upon Izuku's call he brightened frighteningly fast. It would have been cute if he hadn't run over to them with the speed of a race car. Ready for patrol? Izuku made an odd sound he was never going to address as he nodded his head. Mirio didn't seem to care, only smiling wider at Izuku's response. Hitoshi hid a rude laugh behind a cough and they went on their merry way. Mirio kept saying things to Izuku, who responded horribly each time, but Mirio couldn't care less apparently. And Hado was bugging Imajiki about practicing his people skills after class, but he's still so nervous. The whole patrol went by and at the end Izuku's nerves were fried. Hella crispy. Nothing left there but ashes, really. Mirio, aka the best person ever, seemed to notice Izuku's weariness and toned down his enthusiastic remarks. They made it inside the locker room and Izuku was ready to splat on the floor like a cold, uncooked tortilla when his phone buzzed halfway through changing out of his costume. One of the news apps was doing a report on the buildings that were destroyed in fires. One of them had been the one they heard going up in flames on their way back from dinner, but the other two were from much less fancy districts, according to the article he was reading. Oh, the address to one of the buildings was actually sort of familiar. Was that his old apartment complex? Izuku rubbed his eyes and reread the address. Aw hell, it was. 3 buildings go out in the whole of Japan and one of them was one he used to live in. God damn it, this better not be nope, Izuku told himself, sighing tragically. If this didn't turn out to be something that made him want to tear his hair out, he would volunteer to be May's test subject. For a year. Wait, no, that might actually kill him. He'd volunteer for a week. Izuku could bring it up with Aizawa later, but for now he just wanted to collapse in his bed or maybe Shoto's and sleep away the twitchiness rolling in his skin. Dekiru, Yamazawa, Uraraka smiled at the sight of them from down the path. She and Tsuyu sped up to catch up to them on their way into the 1A building. They usually saw each other coming back from work studies, sometimes catching Yaoyorozu and Kirishima on their way back from Fat Gum, too. Man, I'm beat, Uraraka said. I can't wait to eat whatever Sato made for dinner. Sato cooked? Hitoshi was quick to ask. Izuku brightened at the comment, too. Eating Sato's cooking whenever it was his turn to coordinate a meal was always a good way to end a day. He could just make us rice and still think it'd be the best thing I've ever tasted, Uraraka sighed dreamily. It's because he's an angel, Izuku said, just as starry-eyed. They all broke out into quiet laughter at their own silliness and entered the dorms. True to their hopes, Sato had cooked a wonderful meal for all of them to enjoy. Izuku just about cried when he took a bite, still scorned from Kaminari's failed attempts at putting together a meal. They didn't have someone plan out a meal every night, but even with time and assistance, mostly from Ishido and Yaoyorozu, Kaminari still managed to make something that got them banned from the kitchen entirely. Of course, Izuku didn't think Ishido or Yaoyorozu had any real idea about cooking. He passed by the kitchen when their disaster meal was being made and Ishido seemed to rely mostly on unhinged instincts and Yaoyorozu was a rich kid that didn't quite know her way around the kitchen. Kaminari was just trying to make everything at once and it did not work out. Izuku wandered to Shoto's door, pleasantly full and dead on his feet, and was pulled into one of the most comforting embraces ever the moment he stepped inside. Izuku melted against Shoto and curled his arms gently to return the hug. How was your day? Izuku mumbled into his shoulder. The kids called me 5PP man today, he grumbled. But I think it was okay. Lean them down to get settled under the blankets. I actually spoke to Mirio a little bit, he confessed, half mortified. I sounded like a dying cat each time though. Oh, that's good. The talking part, Shoto said, not the dying cat part. He didn't know everything about why Izuku was apprehensive about talking to Mirio, but he knew enough to be proud of his progress. Bakugo's actually acting mature, he said, pulling a surprised noise out of Izuku. I know. I think he might have noticed that the bratty ones act like him. Izuku snickered, looking at Shoto warmly. What, he didn't already know he had the temperament of a grade schooler? Guess not, Shoto shrugged. How's he doing, Bakugo? Izuku clarified. He hadn't heard diddly squat about Bakugo in weeks and it was kind of weird. Not particularly bad, just weird. He's quieter, Shoto said. Like he's thinking about things more than before. He still yells and curses, but I think getting kicked out of 1A really woke him up. Good, Izuku said. He better be waking up after Izuku stopped Aizawa from expelling him. Lights out, Shoto yawned into the lull of their conversation. Lights out, Izuku nodded. Repeat the plan again, Eri. I'm going to ask him for help, she recited carefully. I'm going to look scared and say that I need him to follow me. Alone, he snapped, he needs to follow you alone. Alone, she repeated, I'll get him to follow me alone, and he grunted impatiently, uncaring of how she flinched at his tone. And then you'll trap him, she said, her voice quieting, and we'll bring him back with us. He slammed the door behind him when he left. The quiet in her room left too much space for her thoughts to run wild. She wondered why this person mattered so much. Why she needed to be a part of this plan. Would he be as kind as they assumed, not giving question to whether or not he would help her? Would he know if something was off? Should she try and run? Now that she's been given a chance? Would this be another reason for Chisaki to call her a curse? Purposefully dragging someone else into her world of nightmares? Would he be right in calling her an abomination, if she hoped this stranger was kind and helpful? Would he be right if she hoped she could finally not be alone? Eri just clutched at her blanket tighter and shut out the questions, counting the stray threads in her blanket until her eyes drooped. 1, 2, 3, 4, it was awful of her, but she hoped Dragon-san's plan worked. Maybe she wouldn't be so lonely if he still liked her after he found out she tricked him. Or maybe he would hate her, she would find out tomorrow. Mei, I swear to God. I'm the only god here, Zuzu. Mei cackled. Izuku watched in morbid fascination as the exoskeleton powered up and Mei stood. She was almost as tall as the room, and when she hit their table by accident, it went flying. They were inside one of the gyms. No adults in sight, and Izuku should have tried to get a straight answer out of Mei before agreeing to a demonstration. This is your big project? Izuku yelped, scrambling out of the way as one of the clunky limbs swung at him as Mei turned to face him. Yeah, she grinned. You almost can't see the crazy in her eyes when she's that far up there, Hitoshi said, drinking his coffee from a safer distance. What did she say the chance of this exploding was? Only 15%, Izuku yelled, dodging another limb and hastily joining Hitoshi to stand far, far away. Oh, only 15%, Hitoshi mocked, before shouting, good job. Mei, your chances of blowing up are a lot lower than I thought they were. I know, she laughed. Oh, to be a mad scientist, Izuku thought. Quieter, Hitoshi nudged him with his elbow. You gonna be good for patrol later today? He asked. I know Mirio asked to meet up with you today. Are you gonna be cool with the one-on-one? Izuku wasn't totally sure they were going to talk alone, considering the room Mirio told him to meet inside was Sir Nighteye's office, but Izuku nodded. I'll manage, he said confidently. Hitoshi didn't exactly know why Izuku suddenly had such a problem talking with Mirio, but he hadn't inquired beyond a few searching glances and assurances that Izuku could lean on him. One for all wasn't a topic he could really broach with him, but his words comforted Izuku all the same. Mei shook the ground with a few hard stomps. Should we get her out of there? Izuku asked. One of the joints smoked as she moved. Yep, Hitoshi said, setting down his coffee. Izuku stepped into the office, Sir holding the door, and was surprised to see Yagi in the room, too. Young Hayama, Yagi said cheerfully, it's good to see you. It's nice to see you, too, Izuku smiled. Do you know what Mirio wants to talk about? Yagi shook his head. I'm afraid not. He was quite secretive about the topic, but I believe it has to do with One for All, considering all of our presences. Mirio joined them shortly, declining the tea Yagi sat out for them. Izuku sipped his tea quietly as he greeted them. Judging by the calm carefully sewn into Mirio's tone, they were in for a serious discussion. Mirio took a deep breath and glanced between the two of them. I want to know about All for One. Izuku's grip on the teacup went white-knuckled, any tranquility zapped from his body and replaced with cold terror. I'm part of a bloody legacy, Mirio continued. His organization kidnapped Izuku and he was strong enough to completely drain you, All Might. He's killed all the holders of One for All but us. I want to know our enemy. It wasn't an unreasonable request, Izuku told himself. He wasn't asking to meet the monster. He just wanted to know about his shitty psyche. Everyone present had a good idea of who All for One was and could give him a profile fitting the kinds of horrors rolling around in his potato head. Yagi seemed to be of the same mind, nodding seriously. I fought him with the intention of making sure you would never have to meet him, but I will tell you what I know. Yagi started painting a gruesome picture, detailing All for One's obsession with One for All, his narcissism and cruelty. Everything he did to the past users had been personal, and everything he did to build his empire in the meantime was brimming with violence. Mirio turned to Izuku as Sir Nighteye finished his own expository of All for One. Izuku had been content to listen and focus on the warmth of the tea through the cup seeping into his hands. Yagi was being careful of Izuku's reactions, glancing over to check on him every so often. Izuku's body was only getting more and more amped up. I don't know how much of him you saw during your time with the League, Mirio started, and Izuku realized the tea had gone cold in his hands. He struggled to keep his breathing steady. But do you have anything to add? Anything you noticed? Yagi watched him carefully. When Izuku met his gaze, Izuku understood the gleam in his eyes. He wanted Izuku to tell Mirio, and since Sir Nighteye didn't really know either, he would end up revealing the truth to him, too. Izuku set his teacup down and took a steadying breath. He stared at his hands curled in his lap. When I met him, he was calm, aloof. Izuku thought of his smile as his tendrils shot forward, giving him pull. When I insulted him, he snapped to put me in my place. When my body stabilized with pull, he was curious about why. He analyzed the possibilities and posed theories. He didn't care about me at all aside from the answers I might be able to give him. Izuku's ironclad grip on his fear seemed to give out there, but Izuku wasn't done, damn it. If he wanted to tell Mirio, he would. Afraid or not, others present or not. Izuku started weakly. He cleared G himself. He wanted to put another quirk inside me to see if I would be able to withstand it or become brain-dead like the other Nomu. And I say other because he included me as a Nomu. The only reason he didn't. Izuku paused, his chest tightening, his breath stuttering. It's all right, he told himself. Yagi wanted Mirio to know. Izuku wanted to lighten the weight in his chest. I asked him if All for One was like One for All, Izuku said, hearing Mirio's breath hitch. He forgot about experimenting on me the moment I said it. He wanted to know how I knew about One for All. If I knew who Nine was. Silence built in the room, the severity of his confession dawning on Sir and Mirio. Yagi met his gaze and nodded subtly. Izuku expected his approval to be a relief, but it only made the static in his ears whine louder. So, Mirio began haltingly, his voice strained with forced calm as he glanced between Izuku and Yagi. Does that mean he knows who I am? Izuku was glad he had put the teacup down. If he hadn't, he would probably have had to replace it for Yagi. What? Izuku said, quiet as an unexpected amount of rage and betrayal crashed into him. Young Mirio, I mean, it's okay if he, why weren't we informed he knew of Mirio? They all spoke at once, their voices overlapping. Izuku shouted over all of them. I would have died before giving you up to that monster, Izuku snarled, the words coming out guttural and choked and furious as he stood and faced Mirio. You hear me? I would never have told him your name. Mirio only looked confused, making the feeling storming inside of him thunder. Did he think Izuku would just give him up, to a terror like All for One? What kind of friend did he think Izuku was? Did he think so little of him? But, if you didn't give him my name, Hayama, Sir said solemnly. What did he do to you? Nothing, I didn't survive, Izuku answered stiffly, feeling itchy and clammy, cold and hot all over. He wanted to get out of his skin, wanted to claw it off as they all looked at him with varying expressions of pity or regret or something else he didn't care for. Is this why you've been avoiding me? Mirio asked, his voice haunted and small. Izuku looked away from him and nodded. Yes, why didn't you tell me? I didn't think it'd do anything good, Izuku said. I didn't tell him anything and… You were tortured, Mirio yelled. That's what he did, right? All for One tortured you for my name. Yes, Izuku said. And you didn't tell him? No, he snapped, his irritation spiking at being questioned again. When were you going to tell me? Mirio asked. Would you have said anything at all if I hadn't brought it up? I don't know, Izuku faltered. He had wanted to spare Mirio from the knowledge of All for One's questions. He didn't see the point in telling Mirio something that would only hurt him. You should have told me, Mirio said, His face pinched in a scowl he directed at the floor. "You should have told me," he repeated. "I'm telling you now," Izuku said, a brittle edge to his voice. The argument was weak and they all knew it. Izuku was about to crumble, and by the looks of things, Mirio might be right there with him. Mirio's frown stayed in place as he made his way out the door. "Whoa, you don't look good," Hitoshi said, watching as Izuku pulled on his hero costume. An hour or so had passed since the meeting Mirio planned, and Izuku was not looking forward to patrol. Given the limited number of heroes at the Nighteye agency, paired with the fact that Izuku didn't want to basically run away from Mirio, Izuku had the recipe for a very awkward, tension-filled patrol. "Mirio and I had a fight," Izuku grumbled, "don't ask." "Damn it," Hitoshi cursed. "I thought you two were getting better." Should have kept my mouth shut, Izuku thought. He had both years of experience keeping secrets and none at all at the same time. During the apartment years, no one really bothered with him aside from Bakugo, so it didn't really feel like he had anyone to tell about, getting abandoned and sort of kidnapped as a child. Then the Hatsumes came along and all he had to do was dodge some questions before they backed off. And he didn't exactly have a choice in how the Yamazawas found out. Maybe he was just actually bad at keeping secrets from people. Maybe he wanted Mirio to know. Either way, Izuku would rather not keep thinking about the fact that Mirio just assumed Izuku would willingly give him up to All for One. That stung far worse than Izuku could have prepared for. And he certainly hadn't prepared for it, seeing as telling All for One Mirio's name had never been a fucking question. "Are you two going to be okay to patrol together?" Hitoshi prodded. "It's not like we have another option," Izuku snapped. He winced. Hitoshi wasn't part of this conflict and he certainly didn't deserve Izuku's animosity. "Sorry," he said, "sorry. Yeah, I'll be professional." Hitoshi nodded. "Good, let's just hope Mirio can be, too." Things were going decently, barring the fact that Mirio was completely ignoring him. How the tables turn, huh? It was fine, Izuku told himself. Patrol was coming to an end soon, with the sun setting and casting long shadows down the street. He made Mirio deal with this for weeks. He could handle a little shunning. Hitoshi didn't try to fill the silence this time, leaving them all in terrible, terrible silence. The sounds of the city and the occasional fan kept them from stewing too much, but Izuku was seriously getting twitchy. Quiet had never been his forte, all right. Not when he was a kid, isolated in an apartment. Not when he found a home in the Hatsume household, which was buzzing with noise every single second he was there. And not in the Yamazawa household, where the cats were moving or Aizawa was getting back from patrol, or Hitoshi was shuffling along, or Yamada was talking. The quiet meant he was alone and he wasn't right now, so could someone please just. A building across the street exploded. The blast slammed into them all, knocking everyone around off their feet. The three of them scrambled to stand to face the threat and make sure all the passing civilians were safe. A man stumbled into view from inside the crumbling building, hunched in on himself and twitching like crazy. He was wearing a simple suit, torn and dirty as it now was, and they watched as he crumpled in the street with a shriek. "Help!" he screamed, "please, I don't know what's happening." His hand hit the rubble in an attempt to steady himself, but the moment his hand contacted the ground, everything exploded again. Explode might not be the right word. Nothing was on fire, as far as Izuku could tell. The ground just seemed to burst and crack with the force of the man's quirk, sending everything flying. "Sir, don't move," Izuku shouted, panicking when a piece of the street shot past his arm. "If you touch anything, there'll be another explosion." "He better be right. Please, let him be right." Mirio and Hitoshi were already moving toward the other people laying in the street. Izuku collected his bearings and stood to help, but something tugged on his leg. Izuku turned and saw a little girl with bright red eyes. Eri kept her hand grasped around Serge's costume as tightly as she could. She had to make sure he went into that alley. She had to, or else bad things would happen. She just had to say the things they told her to and everything would be fine. My dad needs help," she said, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. Eri didn't like how Serge's face changed when he looked at her, his expression so much nicer than anyone she's ever known. "Ichi's down there, please help him." "I will," Serge assured immediately, "but I have to know if you're at any help before I go to your dad?" He wanted to know if she was hurt. She was cursed, it didn't matter if she was hurt. But he was asking her anyway. He wanted to help her. Tears welled up in her eyes and overflowed quickly at the overwhelming wave of emotion that crashed through her. She tried to be quiet, tried to wipe away the tears, but they weren't stopping. Her voice wobbled. "You're so nice," she whispered, feeling so sad. "You just want to help." "Yeah," Surge said softly, "course I do." What would Chisaki and Dragon do to him if she led him down that alley? Would they strap him to the chair and take him apart over and over and over again? Would they leave him alone in a room for hours and only take him out so they could poke him with the needles until he felt like falling asleep? "I can't do it," she cried. "I can't make you like me." She was a horrible, cursed monster, but she didn't want Surge to come back with her, even if it meant she wouldn't be alone anymore. Because taking him back with her would mean he would stay with her. Stay when they shut her in the room, stay when they turned off the lights before she was asleep. Stay when they bound her to the chair and took her apart. Would they take him apart, too? Eri couldn't let it happen. Not to a kind person like Surge. "I lied," she hurried to say. "Dragon is waiting in the alley." He froze, and in the second he stared at her, she worried that he would hate her for trying to trick him. But his face didn't twist into something mean like Chisaki's would. He just took a deep breath and nodded. "I'm glad you told me," he said. "I need you to find a friend of mine quickly, okay?" Eri nodded and listened to his description of someone named Lemillion. She took off running and scrambled over the broken street with painful steps. Her feet bled more with each cut, but Surge wanted her to hurry. Loud noises and flashing lights irritated her as big cars started pulling up to the demolished street, and that's when she saw him. "Lemillion!" she shouted as loud as she could. Her voice was sharp, the tone high from her fear and long-standing disuse. Surge's friend was in front of her faster than she realized someone could move, asking her all sorts of questions. "Surge needs help," she panted, stumbling over an explanation of what happened. Lemillion paled and shouted for someone else. Another hero ran over to them, his purple hair sticking up as the bandages around his neck zipped back to him from their tasks. "Surge is in trouble," Lemillion said. "Make sure she stays safe." And then he was gone, and she was left alone with Surge's other hero friend. "I leave him alone for 2 minutes," he muttered before turning to her with unbearably kind eyes. "Hi. I'm Pied Piper. Let's get your feet off this dirty street." "Come out, Dragon," Izuku shouted from outside the alley, his multi-pen support weapon ready to fire in his hands. "I know you're there." From the shadows of the alley, his silhouette emerged. A slight glow from his eyes and throat calling forth Izuku's adrenaline. "Stupid girl," Dragon hissed. Smoke floated from his mouth as his curled into a scowl. Should have known she couldn't listen. "Turn off your quirk and come quietly," Izuku ordered, stomping on the fear crawling up his neck and crushing his chest. Dragon laughed. "You can't play hero when I know what you are, Izuku." "Yeah?" Izuku asked, pointing his weapon at him. "You think I care about your opinion of me? After all you've done?" Sparks shot out of his mouth when he snarled. "All I've done?" he growled, the glow in his cheeks and throat brightening. "Everything I did because you ruined my family. You're an abomination," he spat. "A curse that needs to be snuffed out before you cause more damage." "I ruined the family?" Izuku said, incredulous and bitter. "You burned us. You choked us with your smoke. You ruined our family long before I got my quirk, and you're just using it as an excuse. You and Inko needed to learn to listen to me," Dragon seethed. "Your curse just showed me I had been doing it wrong." What? Had his vision in Izuku's quirk said things that made him leave? What could his insecurities conjure to make him into this much of a quirkist fanatic? In the split second of his shock, Dragon whipped out a gun of his own and fired. Izuku fired too, explode catching on Dragon's shoulder when he tried to dodge the shot. Something hit Izuku's neck. A prick followed by a larger impact made him stumble. Izuku hissed at the pain it caused his scar and plucked the red bullet out of his skin. Red? Like the kind he saw. When did he see something like this? "We are going to cure you soon." Fire burned through him with a ferocity he couldn't comprehend. Branching from his neck to the rest of his body like gasoline had been thrown over his veins. Everything inside of him was scorched by the feeling, burning away his thoughts and his senses with the pain that blazed through his bones. Nothing he saw made sense anymore, nothing he felt could be understood through the filter of agony that was thrown over his mind. "Don't worry," said a voice that sounded very far away, Contrary to the voice's words, Izuku found that he should be incredibly worried. That was just one of the temporary ones. When Mirio arrived at the alley the girl described, all he found was an empty street with a single red bullet and Izuku's gun laying in the rubble. In her lab, Mei was sitting on her desk, revising her designed blueprints for the exoskeleton when an incredibly distinct alarm went off on her phone. Mei's head snapped towards the sound, her plans and machinery forgotten as she threw herself over to the workbench where her phone was buried under papers and trinkets. She swept them all off the table with her arms, uncaring of the loud bangs her things caused as they crashed to the ground. Her phone blared and she finally unearthed it from the mountain of clutter. She opened her app and scanned the information it gave her. Zuzu was in the red zone, his vitals jacked up and his location moving through the city quickly. But he was alive. Mei bolted out of her lab, crashing through every doorway to the hero buildings as she called her moms. "Ma," she said, "get mom and prepare for war." Shota was having a quiet evening when the distant sounds of a tornado came hurtling towards his room. Several of his security alarms went off in a sequence before his door was practically broken down and a heaving gremlin child stood on the remnants of his door. "Zuzu's been kidnapped," she burst, lighting every nerve in his body on fire. "What?" he snapped. "I know where he is." She held up her phone, showing where it tracked a moving pin across the city. "But you should probably hurry." Frankly, Mitsu didn't give a shit that she and her wife were probably interfering with some laws. Mei had given them a location and a way to track Izuku as he was moved and they were going to find their son. Ayumi tied back her hair, a shining pair of brass knuckles clinking in her lap as Mitsu made a sharp turn. Mei said that Izuku was probably caught up in some bad shit and they believed her, but there was a reason Izuku won his fights in the sports festival with his fighting skills. Fighting skills he learned from them. "I'm going to shatter their bones if they hurt him, Yumi," Mitsu promised, her knuckles going white around the wheel. "I'm going to make them regret ever thinking they could take him." Ayumi made a noise of agreement, the odd and familiar cross between a growl and a warbling hum. They caught up to the pin on the map, a large black car making its way down the street in an inconspicuous manner. Mitsu cut it off and took the impact when she clipped the cars. The crash tossed them both off course, but Mitsu took rammed into the front of the car again before hopping out with Ayumi. Ayumi slashed their tires and Mitsu tore open the front door. She narrowly dodged a torrent of flames, a roar tearing from the mouth of the man in the car. He jumped out of the car, face alight with the glow of his quirk. Smoke trailed out from the sides of his mouth as he zeroed in on her. Mitsu blinked when she got a proper look at his face. "No fucking way, are you Midoriya Hisashi?" she demanded, met with another jet of flames instead of an actual answer. "Are you Midoriya Hisashi?" she growled, charging at him. He managed to burn her arm this time, but she knocked him down. She slugged him hard, following with heavy jabs into his abdomen. She brought him close while he was stunned and kneed him in the groin before turning him around with his arms and kicking the backs of his knees. He bucked under her weight, heat radiating from his face, but Mitsu held his neck down and twisted his arm at an uncomfortable angle, not caring in the slightest when her hand started blistering from the heat of his skin. "Are you his father?" Mitsu snarled. "Yes or no, asshole." He tried to throw her off again and she squeezed his neck as she pulled on his arm some more, letting her nails dig into his skin. Fire blazed from his mouth, charring one of her knees and causing the heat of his neck to bite further into the skin of her hand. She jolted and he whipped out of her grasp, tossing her onto asphalt and creating distance between them. "I want no claim to that abomination," he snapped. "He's no son of mine." "You're damn right he's not," Mitsu spat, standing despite the hell her leg gave her. "He's my son, you hear? You're a shit person and a shittier father and you will stay the hell away from my son. He needs to be cured," he shouted, his voice gravelly from his quirk. "He's cursed." "Yeah, I'd call having you around a curse," Mitsu said, her body tensing for round two. "I think I can cure that, though. What do you think?" Ayumi ripped open the back doors of the car. Mitsu could take care of herself until reinforcements arrived and Ayumi had her brass on in case trouble came her way while she rescued Izuku. He was practically a grape compared to the things she could lift, no matter his weight, so she had been tasked with his retrieval while Mitsu got to beat someone up. Izuku looked bad. His skin had taken on a sickly pallor, cold sweat collecting on his skin. A spot on his neck was hot and swollen and his breathing wasn't steady. Ayumi knew absolutely nothing about what happened to get them to this point, but she knew he had been poisoned. By a drug or an actual poison, she wasn't sure, but she wasn't keen on taking chances. Not with her son and not when her wife's life was on the line. Bolting to a hospital seemed like an excellent option, especially considering the light show happening where Mitsu was hopefully kicking the shit out of somebody. Mitsu could take care of herself, but that didn't mean she would get out of all this unscathed, and Ayumi could bet on some gnarly injuries based on the amount of heat coming her way from their fight. "Yumi!" Mitsu yelled. She caught sight of his shadow and dodged a shot of fire. Ayumi's skin felt stretched by the dryness caused by her new proximity to the heat. The man tried his hand at punching her, but all he did was allow Ayumi to get in close. She deflected his punch and made use of her brass knuckles, listening to the satisfying sound of the metal smashing into his face. The back of her hand was singed from the heat of his skin, but that didn't stop her from kicking him clean off the ground and sending him back to Mitsu. She hoped she broke his ribs. Ayumi returned to the back of the car to grab Izuku and hightail it out of there. Izuku's body flinched when she touched him, but she didn't hesitate to sling him over her shoulder. She was pretty sure he threw up on her a little, but that was fine. There were far worse things than bile and vomit that she had come into contact with. With her son secured, Ayumi made a run for it, darting out of the relative cover of the car and sprinted down the street and around the corner. Mitsu spat blood onto his face the moment he let her get too close. It actually boiled on his skin, which was not a great sign for her. Mitsu could fight like nobody's business, but grappling was her strong suit, and if he got too hot for her to grip onto, shit could get real nasty. Her knuckles were already blistered from the punches she managed to land on his face, and the rest of her body wasn't doing too hot. Well, it was actually too hot, but anyway, he could throw a decent punch. She could give him that because her face ached in testament to that particular skill, but he was shit at everything else. He relied on his quirk to do most of the heavy lifting, and she was loath to admit that plan was going to work if she didn't manage to knock him down soon. A good hit to his jaw should work as a quick knockout, but she needed to get close to his front, which was a terrible idea on multiple fronts. But mainly too, her hands were already fried, and hitting his face that close to the old lava bucket would further burn her hands. Hitting his jaw would also require getting right in front of him, putting herself right in the path of said lava bucket. She was liable to be turned into ashes, and that was not on her bucket list. Mitsu wanted to be alive to scold and hold her son. And maybe have a conversation with Mei about who she currently has trackers in. Asshole sperm donor was slowing down like she was, thank God. It seemed like shooting out that many flames took a toll on him. Mitsu watched him. His recharge period was longer now. He was running out of juice, and all she had to do was outlast him. Make him fire off more blasts until he could only throw smoke and sparks. Mitsu rolled her shoulders and charged. Ayumi ran into Aizawa during her dash through the streets, his car skidding with the shrieks of his tires from the abrupt halt of his racing car. "Is he all right?" he asked urgently. Ayumi shifted Izuku a little so she could sign, "Sick, maybe drugged, he needs a hospital." He nodded, turning to Yamada. "Drive them to the nearest hospital, I'll go help Mitsu." "Be safe," Yamada ordered. Aizawa ran off into the night, and she ducked into the backseat with Izuku as Yamada quickly sat in the driver's seat. "Buckle up, I am going to break many traffic laws," Yamada advised. Wisely, Ayumi listened. She ran at him right after he tried to barbecue her, slinging her fist at his chest first to steal his breath before socking his jaw. The sound of his body hitting the pavement was better than Beethoven could ever hope to be. She kicked him a few times for good measure before backing off and allowing herself to fall on her ass. Jesus, everything hurts. A familiar scarf weaved around her downed opponent's body and secured him, Aizawa stepping into view. "Little late to the party, Aizawa," she said. "You see Ayumi? She and Hizashi are taking Izuku to the hospital," he answered. "First responders should be here soon. They can help you and get you to them." "Is whatever the fuck this is going to follow him to the hospital?" Mitsu asked. "Please say no?" "I don't know," he admitted regretfully. "But if it does, Hizashi and Ayumi won't be the only protection he has." Other pros got involved at the scene where this started. Apparently some guy was shot up with trigger and his quirk caused a lot of damage. "I hate hospitals," Mitsu said. but mostly that our son keeps ending up in them. So do I, Aizawa said. You were really brave to do all that, Hitoshi said to Eri. Thank you. Her lip wobbled, more tears coming as she argued. But I was going to trick him, she cried. I was going to let Dragon take him. Hitoshi swallowed the terror that clogged his throat. Her feet were all bandaged and Hitoshi was sitting in Sir Nighteye's office with her. Eri told him all about Dragon's plan and what they could do to Izuku. She didn't seem to realize that it was important to him that they had done all of this to her, too, but he could deal with that later. But you didn't, Hitoshi emphasized. You told Surge about the plan and came to us for help like he told you. Forget about the bad thing they told you to do and think about this good thing that you did all on your own. Do you really think I was brave? She asked, swiping at the tears on her face. I do, Eri. And I'm really thankful for the decision you made, he said. I'm good friends with Surge, so I'm glad you helped him. She looked up at him with her big eyes and sniffled. Surge wanted to help me. I couldn't let them make him like me. They won't, Hitoshi said fiercely. Izuku had already been put through the ringer as a kid back when he was first experimented on and again when the League kidnapped him. The last thing he needed was to be taken apart by some psycho in a bird mask. She kind of reminded him of Izuku when they first met. Izuku had been shaky in those first days. His whole world turned upside down as his life was picked apart by strangers. Izuku didn't cry this much, but Eri was quiet like him. For all his discomfort and silence, Izuku had the tendency to meld with it when he was given the chance, and Eri acted the same way. Hitoshi chattered about other topics, lighter than human mutilation or kidnapping, and she let him fill the silence with his low voice. Eri nodded off against his arm, slumping into him with a tired yawn. Hitoshi let her fall asleep against him and wondered just how long he would have to wait for an answer to the only question that mattered to him. After some time, Mirio walked through the doors, looking exhausted but relieved. Hitoshi resisted the urge to shoot to his feet, tensing but keeping still for Eri's sake. Is he? Izuku's fine, he confirmed. He's at the hospital but he's stable. He sagged against his chair. I'm never going to leave him alone again, Hitoshi promised, tipping his head towards the ceiling. He's going to have to learn how to go through life with me adjoined to him all the time, because the second I turn around, he gets into trouble. Mirio gave a tiny laugh, but the sound was too weary, so it ended up just being a really sad sigh. Hitoshi wondered if the child next to him was too much of a flight risk to take to the hospital. Because Nighteye may object, but he wasn't about to leave a kid alone in the agency. He also doubted that there wasn't some sort of medical issue that the EMTs didn't have the time or technology to deal with lingering in Eri's body. He would bring her to whatever hospital Izuku was taken to and meet up with Dad. How would you feel about accompanying me to the hospital? Hitoshi asked. I'll get our things, Mirio answered promptly before disappearing to the locker rooms. What do you say? Mei prodded annoyingly. Thank you, Mei, Izuku said, rolling his eyes. We will be having a talk about putting trackers in people, Mitsu chimed from her bed. For once, Izuku wasn't the one who needed to stay in a hospital bed. Trigger made him weak, but the doctors said he just needed to rest for a few days and get the drug out of his system. Mitsu, on the other hand, was nursing burns upon burns, and the doctors wanted to make sure she didn't fall ill from an infection before they released her. Mei scoffed. It helped, yeah, she agreed, but not all of us have a history of getting nabbed right off the street, and I know Izuku isn't the only person you have getting tracked. Izuku wanted to be offended, but she was right. The police had taken their statements when it became clear they weren't going to die while they were being questioned, and Izuku was sure that there was a report somewhere that stated how he literally got taken off the street. Yeah, I for one, would like to know if you injected something in my skin, Hitoshi said. Or sewed something into my clothes. I have no idea what you did to Izuku. The late night started to catch up to all of them now that the danger was gone. Izuku dozed on and off in the room until Yamada came in to take them back to Ua. Mei, Hitoshi, Mirio, and Izuku all squeezed into the car with him and stumbled to their dorms with the teacher escorts that came to take Mirio and Mei to their separate buildings. Aizawa was apparently taking care of the little girl, Eri's situation. Yamada pulled Izuku and Hitoshi into a hug before leaving. You gave us quite the scare, listener, he murmured into Izuku's hair. Think you'll be fine for the rest of the night? Izuku nodded, melting into his warm embrace. Yeah, Pops. You better be, Hitoshi warned. Give me at least a few hours to sleep before you start being a trouble magnet again. I think about it, Izuku teased. Inside his own room, Izuku crawled under the covers and let himself forget about everything that happened, if only for a while, as he drifted to sleep. Izuku blinked, his eyes open to inky darkness. In the corner of his eye, the darkness was disturbed by a distinct glow. "Yo, re-BCK," Inko said, her voice cutting in and out in tune with her wispy form. "Hisashi shot me a few hours ago," he groused, rubbing at his neck and feeling out the old scar. "I think it was one of those quirk erasing bullets. I was advised not to try and use either quirk until I stopped feeling weak. But, if I'm here, does that mean Trigger went after insecurity first?" Inko shook her head. "Insecurity highs," she said. "What?" Izuku asked, not entirely sure what she said. "It knwswn some ingwan sig nay," Inko tried to explain, "Ide." Izuku watched as she flickered in and out of his sight. "Wait, I don't understand." Inko smiled, a dreadful gleam in her eyes. "Pulsient hid, you've envier tried to sue resit." Realization and understanding dawned on Izuku as he pieced her words together. Questions he didn't have time for arose, too. How the hell did that work? He messed up his quirk so bad it actually gained sentience? Well, he didn't really have room for questions, considering he was getting this information from the sentient quirk of a dead woman. But if Trigger went after Pull, what am I doing here? PLL is coming back, she said. So, it's like when All for One first gave me Pull. Can I only come here when I'm adjusting to Pull? She shrugged, I didn't know. I'm SRRY. Will I see you again? Izuku rushed out, distress curling in his chest as he watched Inko flicker in the darkness. Inko's ghostly form glitched, her expression melancholy. She didn't have an answer for him. Not for this. Still, she opened her mouth to say something. Yo. Izuku startled awake, alone in his dorm.